My name is Joe, and when I was in high school, for a year and a half, I was extra-legally imprisoned against my will and subjected to a variety of sophisticated torture methods under the guise of therapy. Since the era immediately following the Korean War and our country's first experience with Chinese brainwashing tactics, it seems that a highly organized group of sadistic con artists have co-opted the methods used by the Chinese for their personal profit. My parents willingly paid a small fortune to have my personality reorganized in ways that would violate several aspects of the Geneva Convention, were I an enemy soldier. But these tactics are being used on children. This is the astounding true story of a for-profit communist-style brainwashing camp for children that operated in America as recently as the year 2009.
It takes tremendous effort, based upon a deep sense of personal responsibility, to survive in captivity and preserve self-respect and self-reliance. Too many men, perhaps because they were products of such a comfortable, secure, often unchallenging society, failed to understand this and suffered needlessly. Those weaknesses which did seem to appear in the course of over 1,000 POW interviews are things we need to know about, that more people must be concerned about.
Mount Bachelor Academy billed itself as a therapeutic boarding school and operated from 1987 to 2009 until it was closed amid credible allegations of child abuse made by me and several other students. Among the reasons listed for Mount Bachelor's closure are sleep deprivation, food deprivation, forced exercise, group punishment, denial of access to communication with the outside world, denial of medical services, and compulsory bizarre rituals, some of them of a highly sexual nature. It is hard to fully articulate the misery of this place. I've spent the last decade of my life doing my best to move on from this traumatic event. I could have been one of the listed accusers in the court case that finally resulted in the closing of this evil institution. I could have accepted over $1 million in exchange for my silence as settlement. I could have faced my abusers in court and seen them put in jail for what they did. But I chose to move on with my life. For years, I threw myself into college, work, and the business of moving on. Now, I have chosen to break my decade-long silence. Much like those American GIs that returned mentally scarred from the Korean brainwashing camps, the things that haunt me the most about my time at Mount Bachelor Academy are not those things that I was forced to do in order to survive, but those things that I chose to do of my own free will.
Yes, I remember.
Tell me, soldier, did you see the sergeant force those men out of the hut into sub-zero weather?
Yes, sir, we all saw him do it. He killed those guys. I'm willing to testify he did.
Well, that's fine, soldier. Now, what were you doing when this was happening?
Well, nothing. Trying to keep warm with the rest of the guys, I guess.
I know that, but what were you trying to do to stop the sergeant from killing those helpless men?
Well, nothing.
Were you afraid the sergeant would throw you out, too?
Oh, no, sir, I wasn't sick. I wasn't stinking up the place.
Well, why not, then? Why didn't you interfere?
Well, sir, I didn't think it was my place to interfere. It wasn't my job.
Do you know how many Americans were in that hut? 40. 40 whose job it was not to risk his comfort, to get up like a man and stand for something. But these failings are shared in some degree by all of us, even though you and I are not now living in the misery and hardships of wartime captivity. Our prisoners were part of ourselves. What they did or failed to do reflects our acts, our failings. What must be understood is that these failings can undo freedoms dearly purchased, isolate the individual even as he becomes submerged in the mass, erode our political and economic and social system as effectively as any shooting war. And they can do so even if no communist or other tyrant exists anywhere in the world. The hard test of durability of our traditions and beliefs, so cruelly condensed in Korea POW camps for an unfortunate few, continues today.
While at Mount Bachelor Academy, I informed on my fellow prisoners. I singled out others for isolation and punishment. I systematically broke people down until they cried and begged for forgiveness. When given a choice to participate in the oppressive system in exchange for extra privileges, I chose self-preservation. I sold out, and it is this failure in my own character that haunts me the most.
Respect, it seems, earned its own reward, not from your fellow POWs, but from the Chinese who always acted promptly.
Poor fellow. What a shame. Obviously, he doesn't place the need of the group above his own selfish purposes. We won't hurt him. We'll take good care of him, just as good as we are taking care of you.
It is exactly these flaws in the human character that traditional communist-style brainwashing camps are designed to exploit. I awoke at 4 in the morning in my childhood home with 2 armed men standing in my room, demanding that I get up and put on my clothes. They turned out to be hired kidnappers who my parents had paid to transport me to the facility. This method was recommended by the school. Upon arriving at Mount Bachelor Academy, I was told in no uncertain terms, should I misbehave, the transporters would be called back, and I would be sent to a different facility. Which specific facility was never explained, but it was implied that it could be anything from a wilderness facility to what they call a lockdown facility. I quickly learned from my fellow prisoners the nature of these feared programs. If I was lucky, I was told, I would be sent to a ranch in Utah, where I would be forced to hike every day in exchange for food and basic necessities. The length of time I would be there would be indefinite, and upon completion of the program, I would be immediately returned to Mount Bachelor Academy. Utah was feared by all students because of the fact that in Utah, your parents can legally keep you in such a program until you are the age of 21 years old. There is very little oversight for any trouble teen program in the United States, but Utah has the least by far. If I was unlucky, I was told by my fellow prisoners, I would be sent to a lockdown facility in a foreign country. Terrified whispers circulated amongst the children of concrete prisons in Central America and the Caribbean, where children were regularly beaten, put in stress positions, tased, and kept in solitary confinement for extended periods of time in dog cages as punishment. In such facilities, we were told, we may be held indefinitely or for the rest of our lives.
Being captured by an enemy is a shocking experience for any soldier in any war. In Korea, this shock was made sharper because no one knew quite what to expect, except possibly the worst. Those heroic soldiers who did try to organize the others for escape or to resist the Chinese were segregated in special, heavily guarded camps for hopeless reactionaries. In this way, divide and conquer. Utter planned isolation of the individual was accomplished by substituting the standards and values of the group for those of the individual. Men who didn't conform, who tried to lead, were denounced as poisonous individualists and segregated as criminals. This is the fundamental device of communism, based on the idea that one man has no significance. He is just a fragment of the mass, the class.
The wilderness programs at Mount Bachelor Academy served exactly the same purpose as the communist camps for hopeless reactionaries. By isolating the troublesome individual from the group at a wilderness or lockdown facility, dissent and insurrection were contained. Despite billing itself as a last-ditch stop for parents at the end of their rope with nowhere else to turn, Mount Bachelor Academy, through their use of other programs, actually weeded out all of the most extreme cases and sent them elsewhere. The students who remained at Mount Bachelor were those students who were afraid enough or conformist enough to go along with the program. This also highlights the interconnected nature of the troubled teen industry in general. Mount Bachelor Academy served as a second-tier program. The wilderness programs were considered first-tier, and the lockdowns were considered third-tier programs. First, a parent would be convinced to send their child to a wilderness program. Then, they would be told that their child is such an extreme case that their child needs a therapeutic boarding school. If the child fails to conform at the boarding school, they are encouraged to send their child to one of the lockdown facilities. Upon arrival at Mount Bachelor Academy, my head was shaved, and I was assigned a peer group. This is actually identical to the terminology used in textbooks about communist brainwashing. The peer group functions as one unit. If one person misbehaves, then the group is punished. Depending on the number of infractions your group had racked up, your peer group was forced to run anywhere from 5 to 20 miles per day. In this way, we became each other's prison guards. Contact with parents was forbidden in the first month. Eventually, they would start to allow you to read letters, but in violation of federal law, every single letter I received was opened before I had a chance to read it.
Oh, yes, once in a great while, there was some mail from home, carefully sorted out, of course. Thus it was that if your wife wrote you every single night for 6 months and told you that she loved you, she waited for you, she prayed for your return, not to worry about her, just take care of yourself and come home. That's the kind of letter you didn't get to see. But finally, when she lets her hair down and tells you that the kids' noses are running and she can't get them in at the dispensary, and the allotment isn't enough anymore, the car's on the fritz, and significantly, she sure wishes she could go out dancing once in a while. This was the one letter you got in your mud hut in North Korea. It might well be your only letter in 6 months.
Before being allowed to read any letters or speak with my parents, however, I was told that I had to write a list of all the moral sins I had ever committed. In front of my peer group, I was forced to read aloud this list of my wrongdoings. That was to include everything from past drug use to sexual behaviors to white lies told years ago. Then, before being allowed to speak freely with my parents for approximately 5 minutes, the first thing they were supposed to hear me say was to be my prepared list of sins. This was a crucial part of the marketing strategy of Mount Bachelor Academy. Before hearing your child say anything else, the first thing they wanted your parent to hear was a list that would likely make them very angry and confirm their original decision to send their child away. Unbeknownst to me, my parents were separately sorted into a peer group of other parents, and entreated to compose their own lists of transgressions, which were never to be shared with me. In this way, it was introduced to the parents the idea that they had sent their children to Mount Bachelor Academy because they had practiced failed parenting strategies. The staff of Mount Bachelor Academy set themselves up as the arbiters of parenting techniques that parents were told would one day improve their relationship with their child.
Then there were the public confessions, where each prisoner was required to stand up and perform an exercise of public self-criticism, confessing to one and all his past sins against society.
Oh, we had several slaves, about 2,000 per acre. Beyond that, we owned most of the land. We drove Cadillacs all over, and there was a yacht for everybody. One for me and one for my daddy, and money was nothing to us.
Not because they believed what they heard or what they said. Nothing of the kind. They simply went along. They did what others expected them to do, even though they knew it was wrong. Why?
But little did we know that this was only to be the first round of confessions, the first phase of torture, known as Phase 1. During Phase 1, we were not allowed to attend school for 3 months. School, we were told, was a privilege that had to be earned.
The Americans were still left mostly on their own as the months dragged on, alone and without alien influence of any kind. Complete isolation. This was typical of many of the American POW camps in North Korea. No barbed wire, no watchtowers, none of the precautionary measures normally taken to prevent escape. Nothing but the cluster of mud huts that make up a Korean village to provide a miserable shelter for several hundred Americans, with seldom more than a few Chinese soldiers to guard them.
Instead of school, we began our day running the half-mile laps around the campus that we had been assigned as group punishment for infractions as minor as failing to tuck your shirt in. If we were able to complete our laps, we spent most of the rest of the day in the woods, sitting around an empty campfire pit, while several unqualified and unlicensed therapists conducted group therapy. Participation was mandatory. Any failure to participate would result in group punishment. Considered essential to the group therapy process was giving what they call feedback to the person being focused upon by the group leader. the term that they used instead of therapist due to legal issues.
Afterward, there were discussions in which every prisoner was forced to participate, but not by the Chinese. Oh, no.
Come on, soldier, get with it. Sum up this lecture for our instructor so we can get some chow.
We quickly learned that giving positive feedback was considered unacceptable. We were constantly told to be your brother's keeper. A failure to give proper feedback was considered a failure of our duty to uphold the group to the highest standards. We quickly learned that the rules of the group were different from the rules outside of group. In group, we might say incredibly hurtful things to our closest friends. Later, in private, we may even apologize for having done so. Of course, such statements were risky because to apologize to a friend for feedback giving during group could be seen as being a look good. A look good was considered to be a student who acts one way in group and a different way outside of group. There was also, of course, always the possibility that the person you apologized to would report you in group the next day for having done so.
But it was after the first few months that we began to see the communist Chinese indoctrination. The application by the Chinese of a finely developed educational program, one that occupied every day, all day, 7 days a week for the great majority of prisoners.
Group therapy in Mount Bachelor Academy was comparable to a loaded gun. Someone was always the target, and the more skillful you were, the better you were at pointing the gun at anyone besides yourself. This meant that you had to constantly maintain a mental archive of the transgressions of others, in case you needed to use it defensively. In layman's terms, Mount Bachelor Academy practiced what the academic therapeutic community refers to as attack therapy. During special group sessions, one person would be placed in the center of the room and surrounded by his or her peer group. The peer group was advised to give only negative feedback to the individual in the center of the circle. These particularly egregious group sessions were called horseshoe groups, due to the seating arrangement during the ritual. The term for being targeted particularly hard during a group session was getting reamed. Excessive profanity was not uncommon, and nearly every single session involved the target breaking down into tears. When you finally broke down and cried, it was considered a breakthrough. The crying person was told what great work they were doing, how this was such a great step for them. The crying person was lauded and appreciated for having cried. A failure to cry would result often in punishments ranging from total social isolation, known as being on bans, demotion, and therefore extension of your stay at the facility, or social isolation coupled with being forced to write essays about your transgressions. This was known as a self-study.
Becoming and remaining in favor with the Chinese included informing on fellow prisoners, telling about bad attitudes and reactionary remarks, or infractions of camp rules. But it really didn't mean much, because after all, the man informed upon was never punished. Not actually. He had only to confess his crime to a sympathetic camp instructor, write an essay promising never to repeat his crime against society, and sign it. That's all. Now, what harm is there in this? The man informed upon wasn't really furious at the man who'd informed on him. He didn't go back to camp and try to kill him or beat him up. He never felt exactly the same about that fellow again, was careful what he said, and never got close to anyone again. He became more isolated, alone.
Eventually, students graduated from Phase 1 to Phase 2. In order to do so, it was required that the students participate in a 48-hour ritual known as the Bridge. The peer group would perform the life step in a windowless hexagon on top of a hill known as the life step room. Before being allowed to enter the life step room, students were made to run laps starting at dawn until we were physically exhausted. We were then fed a meager meal of carrots, cheese, and crackers did not satisfy our caloric requirements after having ran that much. Then finally, it was time to enter the imposing and mysterious room. We were given rules to sign that included not disclosing anything that happened inside the room to anyone who's not currently inside the room. One by one, we individually affirmed our agreement to the rules. Then we began a series of role-playing exercises. Every student was assigned to a role that we were told corresponded to our individual personality types. We were assigned a number. The number denoted our order in the ritual. One by one, the instructors explained to us exactly why the caricature that they had chosen for us described our personalities accurately. Examples of intentionally humiliating roles include the chameleon. This child was said to be a person who changed their personality based upon the people who they were around. The child was made to dance around the room and sing a chorus from the song Karma Chameleon by Culture Club, to musical backing. Another role was called Dudley Do-Right. This child was said to be a person who always believed that he or she was right in every situation. When their number was called, they were made to recite the phrase, I am Dudley Do-Right. Whenever I am right, you are wrong. And whenever you are wrong, I am right. Another role I remember was something like Ms. Know-It-All. This role was assigned to a female student who was considered overly bossy. If anyone else screwed up their skit in any way, Ms. Know-It-All's job was to do it for them and show them exactly how to do it correctly. If Ms. Know-It-All had to be called, the whole skit order had to begin again from the top. Then there was a role known as Boom Chicka. Boom Chicka's job was to walk up to a male student and put her right foot on his left knee. She was then instructed to slap her inner thighs while saying the phrase, This leg is Thanksgiving. This leg is Christmas. Want to meet between the holidays? While she was doing this skit, all the students were instructed to chant the phrase, Boom, chicka, boom, chicka, boom, chicka, boom. The girl asked to do this skit flatly refused. She was in tears and kept saying over and over again that she wouldn't do it. When she refused to the skit, it fell upon Ms. Know-It-All to perform her skit for her. And then the 10 or so skits between her and Ms. Know-It-All had to be performed again. Tearfully, Ms. Know-It-All performed the skit. When it became Boom Chicka's turn again, she once again refused. So, once again, Ms. Know-It-All had to perform the skit. This repeated at least 7 times. At one point in time, I was the male participant in the skit. Her being in tears, I awkwardly looked off to the right as she did her humiliating duty. Eventually, Boom Chicka was hauled away by transporters to a wilderness facility for re-education. That terrified the rest of us and convinced us of the high stakes involved. She was returned several months later and had to begin the whole process again from the beginning at the start of Phase 1. Then, we were made to compose new confession lists. The instructors similarly made their own lists and read them aloud to us. In this way, I learned graphic details about the masturbatory habits of the male instructor that he had decided to share with us in the spirit of radical honesty. We were told that this list was to be even more thorough than the previous list that we had made, and it was also to include things that we had done whilst at Mount Bachelor. We were told that any confessions would be forgiven. The greater school, we were told, were composing their own lists, and if there was an infraction on one of their lists that we had not already confessed to, we would be severely punished.
There were some things I wasn't too proud of. I haven't mentioned before. Like the time I took your food rations when you were sick. Or the time when I took medicine from you. And And I also informed on some guys who were breaking out of Compound 14.
Well, everyone else was doing it. And to be popular, you went along too. If you didn't, well, a guy could become mighty unpopular.
All right, gentlemen, dismissed.
You had a free choice, of course. You could enjoy either popularity or respect.
Rotten crumb.
Not very many chose respect. Only a few.
After several similar exercises, the horseshoe group began. As discussed previously, during the horseshoe you were expected to have some sort of breakthrough involving emotional release, generally tears, and only then would the attacks of your peers cease. We were asked to prepare lists of negative feedback for our peers before we arrived, so that we had the most hurtful things that we could possibly think of saying prepared and ready. The horseshoe lasted deep into the night. I have no way of knowing exactly how long because we were not allowed any clocks. Eventually, our tormentors were satisfied, and we were allowed to sleep for a few hours. The next day, they woke us up early. We were instructed to pretend as if a partner was our parents, and to say all the angry things that we wanted to say to our parents to them. Screaming was encouraged, and if you were not screaming, it was considered as if you were not participating. We were told that our parents and their failed parenting strategies were the real reason we were sent to MBA. We were encouraged to blame our parents for all the shortcomings we were told we possessed. Just as the people assigned as handlers to our parents were convincing them that they were unfit to parent us, we were being convinced that our parents were fundamentally unfit. Much as the communists attempted to win over the American prisoners of war, convincing them to betray their own country, Mount Bachelor Academy would become our new parents, our new family, the much-needed structure we were told was so lacking at home.
If only the boy's family and school and church had helped him grasp and develop the idea of personal responsibility and obligation, had weaned him away from the belief that individual effort was painful and useless. If only he had been taught that he has the ability, even alone, to meet and solve serious problems, then this cold, terrible reality would not have destroyed him.
The bridge was only the first and shortest of 4 life steps. There were more abuses, individual and collective, too numerous to mention. Later in the program, we would be given the option to lead a life step ourselves, and many chose to do so of their own free will. I was one such prisoner. I coveted the status and the privileges associated with that position. Perhaps I also coveted the power, the ability to be sitting on the other side of the sadistic equation. When I found myself in the role of abuser instead of abused, I learned something very dark about myself, something very unsettling. When we learn about the Holocaust as Americans, we often think to ourselves, well, I wouldn't have put up with that. I would be running an underground railroad for the Jews. I would have been killing Nazis left and right. When you learn the dark fact that you would have very likely been a concentration camp guard instead of a concentration camp prisoner, it changes your perception of yourself. When you know that you have participated in evil willingly and of your own accord, and enthusiastically even, you will be forever haunted by your decisions. It's not as if I didn't make any attempt at resistance at first. I saved snacks for several weeks in preparation for escape from the facility, which was isolated in the middle of the Ochiko National Forest in Oregon, many miles from the nearest running water or telephone line. I was caught and punished. Several escape attempts were made by others. All were unsuccessful and generally ended for the child in being returned and demoted. Perhaps some were in fact successful, but any who failed to return we were told were in a lockdown facility somewhere.
Of course, we knew that something was wrong. In every war in the past, some men have always been able to make their way back to our lines. But this was not happening in Korea. In nearly 3 years of captivity in established POW camps, not a single American prisoner successfully escaped and got back to our hands. Most attempts to organize, to establish normal leadership were rejected.
Hey, you guys, wake up. I got a way figured that some of us can make a break and get out of here.
Escape?
Yeah, but we gotta get organized first.
Are you nuts?
I told you I got it figured.
Well, figure some more. You want to spoil things for us? You want to get the Chinese mad at us?
Any secrets you were foolish enough to divulge would eventually become public domain. In front of peers of both genders, students were made to graphically recount tales of past abuse, with molestation and rape being the preferred stories to end a horseshoe as fast as possible. All emotional pain was seen as progress, and so the more emotional pain you were able to inflict upon others, the more helpful you were seen as being. During my 1.5-year stay at this facility, I subjected my fellow students to over 10 hours of the same song on repeat to break them down psychologically. I required them to hold uncomfortable stress positions on the ground in order to break them down physically. I became an enthusiastic participant in my own misery and in the misery of others. I learned that the more miserable a person was, the more I had helped them. I dressed my best friend up in a diaper and gave him a binky and made him pretend to be a crying baby in an infant's playpen in order to humiliate him. These are actions that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I wish I could say that I felt I had to do these things in order to survive, but the fact is that I didn't. I did the things that I did because I wanted to make my life a little more comfortable in the hell that was Mount Bachelor Academy. Although the dark school is now permanently out of business, most of the techniques used there are still common throughout the troubled teen industry. I wish I could say that Mount Bachelor was an extreme case, but the fact is, it remains a fairly middle-of-the-road type program for the unregulated troubled teen industry. Similar schools continue to operate throughout the U.S. and elsewhere in places with even less regulation. If a parent were intentionally malicious and rich enough to arrange such a thing, they could have their child kept in solitary confinement indefinitely in a private prison in Central America under the guise of treatment. It is currently unknown just how many children are suffering such a fate as I speak today, a decade later. As adults, it is our responsibility to look after children, who are the most vulnerable members of our society. I cannot change what happened in the past, but what I can do now is speak out, because no child deserves to go through what I had to go through. If I can keep even one parent from making this disastrous choice, I will feel that this video has done its job. My parents are good people who were targeted by a very sophisticated group of con artists. Many of the staff at the facility even were good people. This is a sociological phenomenon, and although it began in communist China, it is still very much alive and well today in the United States. In many ways, it has been made even more efficient than the Chinese style, and has been weaponized against parents and children for profit. In a nation where imprisonment without charge is illegal, tens of thousands of children are being held in facilities like Mount Bachelor Academy for indefinite periods of time. The programs typically operate in rural counties where they are one of the largest employers and have good relationships with the local sheriff's department. These children have no voice. If we won't speak up for them, who will?
Yet freedom, this dangerous adventure, requires for its perpetuation men and women willing to exert great effort, willing to seek unpopular truth, suspicious of easy solutions, able to make informed decisions, and prepared to act on them with courage. Communism is designed to control human beings through coercion, cutting off information, isolate the individual, submerge in the mass, encourage conformity and passive, uncritical acceptance of authority. All this we saw in communist handling of prisoners. In some degree, then, we fail our test in small ways and large ways, when we do to ourselves the very things the communist tries so hard to do with his captive peoples and captive nations. Our enemies are largely within ourselves. Indifference, passiveness, a lack of standards and values about right and wrong, good and bad. The ultimate weapon for this battle is the mind, the heart, the spirit of free men. This is what Dr. Mayer and the men who worked with him think can be learned from the Korean experience. This is a lesson we must learn.